So sometimes I forget that the sort of things that are obvious if you study the relevant theory, philosophical economic, are not obvious if you haven't done that, which is like for most people. So in the last video I did, I argued that meritocracy is unstable, which is kind of a niche criticism that I don't think a lot of people know about. And it let me talk about status hierarchies, which I think is an important and interesting issue. So I posted a short in relation to that video, and some of the comments that I got were like, yeah, dude, but like it's the best system we got, or hey, what other options do you have in mind, smarty pants? Because that's like how YouTube commenters talk. And then I was like, oh, wait, you guys think that we've like tried meritocracy? Wait, you think we live in a meritocracy? Oh, you think that capitalism is meritocracy? Oh, no. So I decided I had better do a video explaining why capitalism is not meritocracy. And I want to emphasize here that that's not a controversial view. Like, people who defend capitalism, like historically, like people I've already mentioned on this channel, like Robert Nozick, the libertarian, or Friedrich Hayek, capitalist economist, they reject meritocracy precisely because it's incompatible with capitalism or like a free market system. So I don't take this to be a controversial point. Nevertheless, it's actually really important because the idea that, you know, we broadly speaking live in a meritocracy, or that a capitalist system is meritocratic, is A, really common, and B, like I would argue the primary justification that people have for the status quo, economically speaking, right? So like a typical reason for like not caring about extreme inequalities, or like, well, yeah, I mean, there's big inequalities, but like that reflects differences in what people deserve. And like, you know, and that's just what justice is, people getting what they deserve. What's wrong with that? And furthermore, wouldn't it be wrong for us to have like a really progressive tax scheme which takes away what people deserve, or even worse, gives it to the people who don't deserve it, right? So this kind of meritocratic thinking is really, really common, and I think really important to propping up the status quo beliefs. So I figured I had better talk about why capitalism is not actually meritocracy. So I want to do two things. One, I want to talk about like, why do people make this mistake? Because it's not, I don't blame people for thinking like this. I just like forgot that that's still a thing. And then I want to go through a bunch of reasons for why capitalism is not meritocracy, and like why that's not controversial. All right, so let's start with the question, like, why would someone think that capitalism is a meritocracy? Why would you mistake the two for each other? So just as a reminder, in a meritocracy, economic goods like jobs, income, and wealth should go to those who most deserve them. That's the basic idea. This idea of desert is the core notion. And your merit is what makes you deserving. So in the context of a job, usually we think of merit in terms of like, how well are you going to do the job? So your qualifications will tell us that. I mean, it's like, you know, what is your ability and work ethic like? For income, there's a handful of ideas here. The common ones are like your hard work makes you deserving, or the contribution you make by doing your work. For both of these things like gender, race, and class are irrelevant. And so, you know, you shouldn't hire or be paid on the basis of those things. So meritocracy gives you a way of like explaining why various kinds of discrimination are wrong, right? Because they don't reflect what you deserve. Okay, so what does capitalism have to do with that? Well, I think there's two broad features of competitive market systems that are at least reminiscent of meritocracy. The first thing is that, again, in a kind of competitive market environment, it makes sense for employers to hire on the basis of merit, to hire people who can do the job best. Like, that is the rational thing for them to do. So we expect, by and large, meritocratic hiring. Now, of course, you know, evaluating applicants is never perfect. It's not going to be any kind of perfect process, but at least there's an attempt to hire meritocratically. This doesn't mean this must happen, and it doesn't always happen, but at least you can say, like, look, in capitalism done well, that's how hiring should be done, and like that is a meritocratic feature, right? Fair enough. And honestly, I don't have too much to say about that. Of course, again, there are plenty of examples where that doesn't happen, but, you know, by and large, that's the idea. So the second main thing is there's a belief that the way markets work, they sort of ensure that the amount of money you make reflects your merits. This is a little bit complicated and goes back to an earlier video I did about inequality in markets. So some of those ideas might be familiar. So here we kind of already have to get into some complications about like what makes you deserving of income, just to spell out this idea. Like, why would you think that markets give you what you deserve, right? The typical answer to what makes you deserving for non-theorists is hard work, right? We've all heard this plenty of times. Like, well, you know, it's your hard work that you get ahead and you get money, et cetera, et cetera. Theorists, people who defend meritocracy, don't usually go this route, because if you do, it should be immediately obvious that neither markets nor employers really ultimately reward people on the basis of effort, right? Like, if you think that people's income reflects their hard work, you should be really confused about why, manual labor jobs like farm work are paid really poorly. Like, they should be kings, right? That is brutal work. There's lots of brutal work like that that requires an incredible amount of hard work. Meanwhile, someone who just has a bunch of investments, maybe they worked hard to get them, maybe they didn't, or a cushy office job, or even like a perfectly normal, respectable job like a teacher, is just not as much hard work as what a farm worker does. But like, take the investment case. You can make a ton of money just on investment income by doing nothing, by making no effort at all. And sometimes people will be like, well, yeah, but you have to make smart decisions. Okay, but smart decisions, even if that is true, ain't hard work. Those are not the same thing, right? Or like, if you're the sort of person who wants to argue that CEOs work harder than the farm workers, well, it's actually worse than that, right? You would have to take the salaries, and let's say, I don't know, a CEO, I'm sure there's plenty of cases where a CEO, let's say, makes 100 times more than the farm worker. You not only have to argue that the CEO works harder, good luck, you have to argue that they work 100 times harder. You're not going to make that argument, right? Okay. So what markets and employers care about is results, not effort, right? Like, if you could be bad at your job but work really, really hard at it. You're just like crap at it. Like if you put me on an NBA team, I like basketball. You know, for a casual, I was pretty good. I could try really hard. I'm not going to do a very good job, right? That's sort of an extreme example, but you can sort of see the idea. So what theorists who defend meritocracy typically go for then is they say, okay, it's not your effort that makes you deserving of income. It's the contribution you make in doing the work. How much are you contributing to society? This is an approach which has far better prospects of being able to work with capitalism, right? If you remember in that previous video, I talked about, you know, one of the justifications for capitalism is that it is designed, or markets are kind of designed to satisfy wants and needs. And so the thought is like, look, if you make a lot of money, you must be satisfying lots of wants or needs, right? And so that is a contribution. So that's what makes you deserving of your income. So those are, and so like, I'm just spelling out what the idea is. I'm going to criticize that idea later, but that's the kind of idea. Those are the two meritocratic features of capitalism. You expect, by and large, hiring by merit. And, you know, there's at least this idea that the amount of money you make should reflect your contribution to society. So this might explain why people think of capitalism as being meritocratic. Now, I'll also add that there's research on what's called the paradox of inequality. This is something that Jonathan Mice has worked on. So if you search paradox of inequality, you can find, he has like TED Talks on YouTube explaining this. But the idea is, surprisingly, in countries with greater inequality, people tend to be less concerned with inequality. And in part because they're more likely to believe that they live in a meritocracy. So as inequality goes up, people are more likely to believe in a meritocracy. And of course, meritocracy, the idea of it, is used to justify existing inequalities, which would explain why you don't care about them as much. And specifically, it's the hard work version of meritocracy that people tend to believe in as inequality goes up, which is strange. So it's interesting to guess why this is, right? So to me, right, meritocracy just is the language of neoliberal politics. It's the justificatory framework for neoliberalism and justifying inequality, which neoliberalism is all about. So it could be that changes in political culture and political rhetoric have this kind of top-down effect in making people believe in meritocracy and care about inequality less, which allows for more inequality. Alternatively, it could just be a kind of a coping mechanism. As things get more unequal, you're more likely to believe those inequalities are justified, because it would mean things must be really, really bad if these were unjustified inequalities. And that might be hard to deal with. I have some other guesses too that I'll get to later. I don't know, but that's interesting. So that could be another, just that sort of those background conditions could also explain why people are inclined to think of the present system or capitalism as being meritocratic. Okay, so far all I've done is saying like, okay, look, there are these meritocratic features of capitalism. This might explain why people confuse the two. Let's now get to why they're not the same, why they're not even compatible. And I'll start with the bigger, more obvious things, then work to sort of less obvious ones. So the first thing is there's just a major difference in the approach to distribution. The whole point of capitalism, of relying on markets to take care of distributional issues, is just to allow the issues to be settled by free, voluntary exchange between people. Again, I'm just saying this is the idea. So there's no need to have a government to determine what the distribution should look like. But any quote-unquote patterned theory, which is what the libertarian philosopher Robert Nozick called them, where you need to ensure that there's a certain distribution or a certain distributional pattern that obtains, you plausibly need the government to intervene in all kinds of ways to make sure that that happens. And so in the case of meritocracy, the pattern that you need is one where, again, everyone is getting what they deserve. So there's a distribution of desert, of what people deserve, and you need the distribution of jobs and income and wealth to match that. And the point is that markets are messy and sometimes arbitrary, and they don't work in perfect accordance with any pattern like that. And, furthermore, the capitalists will say, like, look, this is a consequence of freedom. Freedom is messy, right? So you would need powerful state interventions in the economy, right? Or massive taxes to redistribute money to make sure everyone's getting what they deserve. And that's that's something that a capitalist, like, for example, economist Friedrich Hayek, would oppose. Here's a quote from Hayek. One need only ask, what would have been the effect if at some earlier date some magic force had been granted the power to enforce, say, some egalitarian or meritocratic creed? One soon recognizes that such an event would have made the evolution of civilization impossible, right? So this idea that markets and capitalism represent this kind of evolutionary force, and we should allow it to kind of do its thing, even though it's not meritocratic, it's certainly not egalitarian. But that's what progress and civilization are based on. There's also the issue, which Hayek also points out, of determining what merit is, or even determining what a contribution is, right? The government would effectively have to make moral judgments about what counts as a contribution and what doesn't. And most people, not just capitalists, don't want governments making these kinds of decisions, right? The concern is that that's just not compatible with political liberalism at that point. If you just leave it to the market, again, you let the distribution be determined by voluntary exchange, and you avoid all that stuff. So let me now dig into some of the details as to why our world or our capitalism is not a meritocracy. So the first thing is that, as I mentioned in the last video, in order for people to get the outcomes that they deserve in a competitive process, the competition needs to be fair. And so you need what's known as fair equality of opportunity. You need to make it the case that, what matters for people's outcomes are their abilities and their effort, and not a bunch of other arbitrary stuff. And we don't have that. Now, sometimes people here, like to point to rags to riches stories and say, well, look, anyone can make it. Even this person who started off at the bottom, or even people at the bottom will be like, well, if I did it, anyone can do it, right? So there must be equality of opportunity because everyone can do it. And you have to say can with that sort of, elongated pronunciation. My favorite version of this is the Will Smith movie, The Pursuit of Happiness. Now, I don't know that the idea of that movie is to say, well, hey, anyone can do it. But I think sometimes people kind of draw that conclusion. Anyways, Will Smith's character starts off, being kind of poor and homeless and in a really difficult spot. But, because he's some kind of mathematical genius and develops a psychotic, unhealthy work ethic and also has a bunch of lucky breaks, he rises up the ranks and whatever, ends up with a lot of money. And this is supposed to be somehow uplifting, right? See, anyone can make it if they also happen to be unusually talented and a psychotic worker. Hooray. But this is a ridiculous line of argument, right? Fairness doesn't require just that it's possible for anyone to succeed. Notice I did the elongated thing there with possible. Even if that were true, fairness requires that people not have major advantages over or disadvantages with respect to each other in ways that don't relate to merit, right? It's like if we're running a race and I start like 3/4 to the end and I'm like, oh, don't worry, you can still win. I might trip. I might have a heart attack. Maybe, who knows? Maybe you're Usain Bolt or something. Right? That's the point is that's not a fair competition. And so when I win, even though you could have won, I can't say that I deserve to win whatever the prize was because it wasn't fair. And here again, I would just point you to statistics on socioeconomic status and educational outcome. In fact, I'll link, there's a nice little fact sheet. It's a little bit old. Things are probably worse now, honestly. There's a fact sheet from the American Psychological Association in the description, which summarizes this research. The disparities in educational outcomes start in kindergarten, and they only widen over time. And for all sorts of reasons, right? Having to do with quality of school, quality of neighborhood, enriching home environment, money for extracurricular activities, the need to support your family or not with work, various environmental, health, and psychological issues, etc. It's a whole mess. And the flip side of disadvantage, of course, is the advantage for people who are from well-off, well-connected families. Like, you don't have to be particularly ambitious or talented or hardworking or anything like that, but you'll be fine if you have the connections, right? I think we've all seen plenty of this. Then there's even more obvious things like just the existence of inheritance. Like literally you can just inherit a ton of money. Someone could just give you a gift, right? The point is not that that's bad. I'm not really talking about that here. Like literally you can inherit a ton of money and then have somebody else manage it for you so that you have income and wealth in perpetuity and you never had to do anything. Like that happens, right? That's not meritocratic, right? Like those are the kinds of people who are afforded the opportunity to like start businesses and stuff because like who else has the capital to do that? There are exceptions, of course, but you see my point. So in short, in our capitalist world, we don't have anything like fair equality of opportunity because things that have nothing to do with merit have a lot to do with your outcome. And you can look at the statistics on economic mobility. You know, if you start in the bottom 20th percentile, it's very unlikely that you make it to the top. Whereas if you start in the top, you got to try really hard to make it to the bottom. Like it's quite rare. So I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that it's all luck. Obviously, ability and effort matter. That's not the point, right? That's not where the goalpost. That's not where the goalpost is. Do those things matter? Of course, but you can't have fairness when the deck is so stacked in favor of some and against others. Again, I'll point you to the case in the race where I get an unfair advantage, right? That's the idea. And all of this kind of partly explains why the idea that we live in a meritocracy is a seductive one, both for the advantaged and the disadvantaged, right? Because it's not like it's just the advantaged who have these beliefs. For people who do have advantage, then they just use meritocracy to justify their advantage and their success. Like, well, my successful outcome is because I'm so great. But for those who are at a disadvantage, the idea of meritocracy gives you hope, right? If I just work hard enough and trust myself or whatever, I can climb the ladder too. If you know that there are structural advantages and disadvantages, like the more people frame it as a structural issue, the less they're likely to believe in meritocracy. But that, if you have that view, it's difficult to kind of maintain this hopeful illusion. On the other hand, if you don't have the illusion, then at least you recognize the unfairness and there's a possibility of some change. Whereas if you just buy into the idea like, oh, I can just do it if I try, then that system never changes. Okay, so the next set of issues has to do with the fact that market outcomes involve lots and lots of luck in all kinds of ways. I'm not saying it's all luck. Just calm down. I'm not saying that. But there is a lot of luck. And meritocracy doesn't like a lot of luck, right? In general, the more your outcome depends on luck, the less you've earned it, and so the less you deserve it, right? That's sort of the idea. Luck kind of undercuts deserved. So where does luck come into play? Well, first, and obviously, there are just lucky breaks and unlucky breaks. In fact, you can even get rewarded for really dumb ideas. It happens all the time, or punished for really good ideas, right? And this is just because you don't have control over supply or demand, and those things can be unpredictable, right? So to take a silly general kind of example, you can imagine a business where the business owner spends all of their money buying these like rubber widgets, thinking that he can market them as toys. And it's a complete flop. It's a disaster. No one wants them. Who wants these rubber widgets? But then for whatever reason, I don't know, there's some kind of natural disaster or a war and there's a rubber shortage. And then this person, they can sell all these rubber widgets at a good price and they end up making a lot of money. So it was a stupid business decision that happened to work out. Likewise, you can have lots of good, well-justified plans that due to bad luck don't pan out. Another example that I like to talk about is the recent chess boom, right, which started because of the Netflix series, The Queen's Gambit. All of a sudden, and to the complete surprise of the relatively small chess community, there was an explosion in chess demand, right? So now lots of people who spent their time learning chess, they might have said wasted their time learning chess, which is typically at least a complete waste of your time financially speaking. Those people can now market themselves as streamers or players or teachers, right? And so a massive explosion in demand created unforeseen opportunities for people who happen to be good at chess. This is good luck. This is great luck. Do those people work and are they talented? Sure. They were before the good luck thing happened, right? So the amount of money that they make or don't, in this case, really strongly depends on the luck of the market, not just their talent and effort. So next, we just have the kind of luck that has to do with talent in general, right? Obviously, people have different talents and interests, and these come in different degrees. I don't really want to get into the deep questions about talent, which are reasonable questions. But right, this already is a source of luck. And more interesting, I think, and often overlooked, right? Because we often talk about like, oh, this person's more talented than this person. At what? There's like a zillion different kinds of talents, right? And so the interesting question, or the interesting point here is, some talents are more in demand than others, just because of the state of the economy, right? So for example, in the past couple of decades, with the explosion of STEM funding and cheerleading, mathematical kinds of ability were in demand. This meant that if you were, average or above average in mathematics, but you were willing to pursue it, I don't know, you could make your way to a relatively safe programming kind of job. Or if you were well above average, you could find good work as an engineer and be paid quite well. If your interests were literature or music or theater or philosophy, well, good luck, right? I mean, good luck even getting the resources to learn about those things in school. But then trying to leverage those abilities into income in the marketplace is even harder, right? You might be exceptional in one of those areas, but since the market demand for them is much less, it's much harder for you to get the pay of an engineer doing those things. Even if you're an incredibly talented person at theater or literature, let's say, and more hardworking than the engineer, you're probably going to have a harder time making as much money as the less hardworking, less talented engineer, just because there's differences in demand, right? And then you can say, well, the person who went into literature should have foreseen that and, done the math thing instead. First of all, you can't always foresee that, right? Probably, what's happening now is lots of people went into programming thinking that was safe, but, I'm guessing that labor market has been drying up for a while. But then the other thing is just people have different interests and abilities. So if I happen to have interests and abilities that are in demand economically, yay for me. Not so much for people who don't have those. So this is another way in which, this is really an argument for thinking that, I don't even know how you do meritocracy with markets, but markets reward luck, or income is dependent on luck in a market system in a way that seems incompatible with meritocracy. Though here it depends on the meritocratic theorist, but I don't know. I'll argue against them here. So then you have the problem of economic rents. This is a really interesting and important problem, and I think one that people don't know about so much. So economic rents are basically income that you make which doesn't reflect any contribution, which is kind of not how it's supposed to work, right? So a classic example is, like, say there's a public road that people use. This road is valuable. People use it to, move their carts and goods from one place to another. But then the road is purchased by someone. Now it's privately owned. And the owner says, you know what, I'm going to install a toll booth. So if people want to use this road, they have to pay me to do it. And let's also assume that, they're going to make a profit on this. It's not just the cost of maintaining it. Well, they're going to make a lot of money, and all they've done is made everything less efficient. They've made things worse. Now people have to stop and pay, whereas before they could freely move through and also use their money on potentially more productive ends. So again, this is an example where you make money, but you don't actually contribute anything. And that was a specific kind of example, but there's the idea of an economic rent is really any kind of unearned income which doesn't have any productive benefit. So when there's monopolies, for example, there's not enough competition, they can usually charge higher prices than they would be able to if there were actually competitors, which would drive the price down. And they make more money this way, but that extra money doesn't actually reflect anything great that they're doing. It's just the absence of competition. The economist Michael Hudson has written extensively about how as the U.S. economy has become increasingly financialized, a greater and greater portion of GDP is actually non-productive economic rent. And I suspect there's a lot of disagreement here about how to characterize these things, but I think his work's really quite interesting. And so I'll just point you to it. In any case, there's reason to think that, a capitalist system will permit rents. Maybe a perfect market competition might not with suitable tax policy, but you would need a lot. Anyways, our system doesn't prevent rents, but meritocracy should reject them. Next, we have to challenge the idea that if you're satisfying preferences, you're necessarily doing a good thing. In other words, just because you're making an economic contribution or just because someone's paying you does not mean that you're actually making a moral contribution. And ultimately, meritocracy, which is about getting what you deserve, requires that you actually be doing something good, right? Desert is a moral notion. Cannot escape this. So if you sell yachts, which make really rich people a little happier, let's say, but which destroy the environment, or you get people to buy useless or harmful things through manipulative advertising, or sell addicting or harmful substances or foods or algorithms, you might make a lot of money without doing any good. In fact, plausibly, you're making the world worse, in some cases, by a lot. In a true meritocracy, you're just going to get what you deserve based on what you put out. So if you're making the world worse, then if anything, you deserve like bad stuff, punishment or something, right? You don't deserve a bunch of money. And, the point of markets is that they don't make those kinds of moral judgments. And sometimes, this is spun as a kind of a virtue. And in some cases it is, right? People will say like, well, who are you to decide what's good and bad? You should let people decide for themselves. And that's what they do in a market. Okay. But like, can we not be ridiculous, right? Do we have to pretend that everyone knows what's best for them, like including me? And even if I did, or even if we do we always do what's best for us? Like, do we have to pretend that manipulative advertising doesn't work? I'm pretty sure that it does. Or, right, like, if you really want to go down that route, then you're like, well, the heroin dealer is doing a great thing because, people really do want their heroin. In which case, you should not only make it legal, but consider them great heroes. But people usually aren't willing to do that. So the last thing is just that lots of contributions that happen in society happen outside of the marketplace, and for a variety of reasons. So an obvious and major example is just like the work that parents do in raising a child. If you raise a child well, you're making a really great contribution to society. Thank you. But you're not going to get paid for it. In fact, like if you live in the US, like it's going to be really expensive. And I'm not saying that one should get paid. That's an open question. Some people argue that. Some people would reject it. But my point is that in a meritocracy, plausibly, you would be paid for raising a child just because you should get what you deserve on the basis of your contribution to society. Though if you do a bad job, maybe you'd have to pay a fine or something. My point is just that a meritocracy would have that. And in a market system, you could expand the market to do that, but that's not the world we live in. And then there's all other ways that you might contribute which fall outside the market, not just volunteer work, but literally being a good and caring person, being friendly, right, is actually does good in the world. And you're not gonna get paid for that, right? Okay, let me stop there. That was a lot. Look, we could probably give more reasons for why it's a mistake to think that capitalism is meritocratic, but this is good enough. And look, if you want to be a capitalist, fine. I see some of the other videos, but do it right. The ideas were always about voluntary exchange and efficiency. If you have to pretend our world is meritocratic because those other two things are lacking in the actual world, then you might just want to reconsider your views on capitalism.